Why don't you share what your life is like now, now that everything's kind of cleared up and life has moved on?
That is interesting that you asked the question in that way, because I think most people assume that everything is cleared up and you've moved on. And that is maybe one of the biggest misconceptions that I deal with on a regular basis, is people assume that everything is good now. And knowing how to handle that is sometimes difficult, because on the one hand, I want to put my best foot forward. I want to be able to face the world and be that conquering hero survivor who made it through the brain tumor challenge. But the reality is there have been many side effects, scars, complications left over from the tumor that I still deal with every day. And some of those things are things that I think are less seen.
Sure.
And because they are less seen, people really don't know that I experience them. And my normal protocol now for living life, I have to have a great deal amount of sleep.
Okay.
My doctor encouraged me to have between 9 and 11 hours of sleep every night.
Wow.
And when I was told this, my reaction was, okay, I have 4 children, so unless you want me going to bed before them and getting up after them, how do I do that?
Well, here's a question. How do you handle, so what happens if you don't get the 9 to 11 hours of sleep?
I am not functional.
And
Truly,
what way?
I am not functional. I cannot think, and sometimes I physically cannot move my body. That sounds like a strange thing,
Sure.
But my brain now has a stop mechanism. And when I get to a point where I've overdone it with my energy, with my physical body, or when I haven't gotten enough sleep, rather than a battery that works when it gets only charged to 60% or 50%, it's like mine just hits a shutdown mode.
Got it.
And if it gets below a certain energy level, I literally do not function. And my family can always tell because of a few key factors. Number one, they will see it in my face. And I mean, my face will physically start to drop, and it will be more visible. The facial paralysis will be more visible. My emotions start to get out of whack. Meaning all of a sudden I will start to feel so overwhelmed by just the fact that I'm still awake, that I'm teary, I'm emotional, I'm acting and looking like I'm completely exhausted. And then in certain circumstances, when I'm really depleted, I actually can't walk well anymore. Not because I physically lose the ability to walk, but because it's too much for my brain to process. And I start to stumble. And my sister has described it that I look like my 90-year-old grandma did before she died. When she was shuffling. Instead of picking up her feet were shuffling on the ground. And I can feel it when it starts to happen, and I try to warn my family.
Sure.
I'll tell my husband, like, oh, I'm starting to lose it. I need to get home. I need to go to bed. Or sometimes I don't even say it, but he can see it, and he'll say, all right, it's time. We need to call it a day, and you need to go home and just go to bed, because there is no other reset.
And I'm actually curious, how did your family handle initially? Because when you have, a mom of 4 children, and especially I'm curious what your husband thought, 9 to 11 hours of sleep. And I mean, what was their initial reaction when it comes to you? It's physically necessary for you to get this rest.
That is a good question. And I think initially it was probably easier to deal with, because initially we were still coming out of all of the hard things. It initially was actually a couple of years of post-hospitalization, because yes, I survived, I got out of the hospital, but we realized when I got home that I was still a sick person, which is not what I anticipated.
Got it.
I believed that by the time I got home, it meant I would be well and healthy.
Got it.
And that was not the case. And so that was a bit of a wake-up call, that my life was going to have many more physical challenges than I anticipated. I believed that if I survived, that life would go back to the way it had been. That I would go back to my normal life. And that did not end up being the case. So right away, I had to learn how to little by little increase what I did every day in order to get back to even not a normal level, but More like a child. When you have a newborn and as they get older, you introduce things one at a time. Foods you introduce one at a time. Activities you introduce one at a time. You're super patient. You realize they are going to fall and they're going to stumble over and over again. That was exactly what my life was like. I weighed 89, 90 pounds when I got out of the hospital.
So you were that light?
Oh, I was so depleted. 5 weeks solid on bed rest, laying down in the hospital, living on IVs, only occasionally being able to eat food. My muscles atrophied. My body literally started to waste away.
Here's a question I have that I'm like genuinely curious about. So like I know like, you know, I've got these black and blue eyes right now. I had a surgery. My son was afraid to actually look at me the first couple days. Like he actually did not want to look at me. I'm curious, how did your husband and your children, how did they react when they physically saw mom doesn't look the same anymore?
Ooh, that was tough because their reaction to me happened when I was in the hospital, and it was only days after having the brain surgery, my first brain surgery, and I was so excited to see my kids because I'm a mom and these are my babies, and I just thought, okay, I've survived this. I need to be able to see my kids. I need them to see me. I need that uplift and that love. And I want them to know I'm still mom and I'm still here. And when they came in to see me for the first time, I'm sure my husband had prepped them.
Sure.
I know he had. And my older kids were pretty good about coming up to me and giving me hugs, but I could absolutely see the hesitance in their faces. In fact, I have a couple of pictures that they took that very first time they brought them in, and even in the photos, I can see it in their eyes. Kind of the bigger eyes for my daughter and my son, you can see the look of concern on his face. Like he was glad to be there to see his mom. He was also very concerned.
And he was nervous, I'm sure.
And he was nervous, and he was 10 at the time.
So give us the ages of
So my oldest son was 10, and then my daughter was 7. And then I had a 4-year-old little boy and a 2-year-old little boy. And actually, the one who dealt with it the best was my 4-year-old.
Really?
Because he knew enough and had been taught enough, and Dad had talked to him that he was expecting it. But unlike the big kids, he didn't have a filter. He wasn't trying to hold things back.
Got it.
He was just being himself.
Sure.
And he has so much energy and enthusiasm and passion that it was actually really refreshing. And it helped me because I didn't feel like he was being any different toward me. His behavior was actually really encouraging for me. He came up to me and threw his arms around Mom and gave me a big hug. And then he's like, "Your eye is not right." And at the time, it was big and wide open, and I couldn't blink, and it was frightening. And of course, half of my head was shaved. And so it was very disturbing for the kids, but my 4-year-old Kason just embraced me who I was, recognized that I was still me, which was so important for my mental health and for my recovery at that time. And so he just immediately went into problem-solving mode, like, what do we need to do? Should I get some tape so that we can tape that eye? I will bring some tape next time we come, and we'll tape your eye closed so that it doesn't bother you, so that you can rest your eye and so that you can blink. The one it was hardest for was my 2-year-old, because he didn't understand what was going on. So even though Dad had told the kids that Mom was going to look different,
still too young.
a 2-year-old is too young to understand. And so when he came in and saw me, he actually would not come to my bed. He stayed by his dad. He wrapped his arms around his daddy's leg, and he stayed right there. And maybe only after a half an hour of being in the room and visiting and talking with the other kids, and him getting to see and hear that is still Mom, even though she looks different.
Now,
by the end of that conversation, by the end of that first visit, 30, 40 minutes in, before they left, my husband said, "Go give Mom a hug." And he actually did come over and give me a little bit of a hug. And as much as I had been looking forward to the kids coming and being there, when they left after 40 minutes, I was completely wiped out. I was exhausted, and I was sad. I was a little bit heartbroken to see how difficult this was for my kids, because I did not anticipate that. And of course, we didn't know I was going to have the paralysis, and so there were just certain things we hadn't prepared for.
That's my biggest question. I want to backtrack really quick, Because I'm curious, what did you feel when your 2-year-old was behaving in this manner? What emotions were going through your mind?
I was devastated. He was my baby. It was my job to protect him, to love him, to help him feel safe. And he came into the situation and didn't feel safe around his mom. Oh, that was really tough. And I think that was part of why it was so exhausting and devastating, is I realized I was not able to do the things that I felt like a mom should be able to do. I wasn't able to provide that protection. He didn't feel safe in the arms of his mom. And, as my youngest too, there's
Sure.
something about the youngest child that you have a special bond, because they're truly your baby, no matter
Yep.
how old they are. And now he's much, much older, but he's still my baby.
Yep.
But at the time, he truly was a small, little one,
Yep.
and that protective instinct was just there all of the time. And I realized not only could I not protect him, but in certain ways, he was apprehensive and nervous about me. And that was really, really devastating. And so after they left the hospital, I got really emotional and I just started to cry and just have this big letdown experience. But then by the next morning, quickly decided, okay, we've got to just make this situation more comfortable for the kids so that they're not afraid of mom, so that they're comfortable coming, and if anything, that they want to be here, that this is somewhere that they can have fun. And so from that point on, we let the nursing staff know, and we had them prepare for when the kids were coming, and they brought in the little gloves and they blew them up like balloons.
Yep.
They went to the soda machine and got drinks for the kids. We also did some things to prep me. And so I actually made sure that when the kids came from that point on, that my eye was covered. So I wore an eye patch so that it was not as distracting for them. And that actually created a little bit of levity because mom was a pirate.
Sure, yeah.
And so we were able to look at it and address it in a way that we felt like would be positive and uplifting, and put a little humor and a little lightheartedness back into the situation so it didn't feel so heavy.
Yeah.
Because I think that first visit was heavy for everyone. It was kids' first time seeing mom after brain tumor surgery, head shaved, although at the time a lot of my head was covered up with bandages. Still, that was a little disturbing as well to see.
It could be scary. It could be scary to see that.
It can be scary. And my daughter told me later that she had nightmares, that we were going places as a family and she couldn't find me. Not because I wasn't there, but because she didn't recognize me.
You. Wow.
Because I looked so different. And that was, again, as a mom, your heart is just...
Yeah, and I'm curious, how did you handle the emotion of guilt? Because there has to be a level of, you're a go-getter, you're someone that, previous to the surgeries and everything, you were, and you still are, right? But you've always been someone that, hey, I can get this done, I can charge through. You had to feel some level of guilt.
I have felt a great deal of guilt, and a big part of the last several years has been trying to figure out how to navigate my feelings and my emotional and mental health, which is honestly something I didn't give a lot of thought to before.
Yeah.
I wasn't a super emotional person. Some girls, even as teenagers, are, drama. I wasn't like that. I was always pretty steady. I was always positive. And that's how I remained throughout my adult life. And so really, when all of this happened, it was my first experience in dealing with my own mental and emotional health. Outside of having kids, when I did go through some natural, baby blues for a little while, or other emotions around having children, which are very normal. That was probably my very first foray into the world of exploring my own mental health. But this was different. I have had a real life change, and it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't changing. And my emotions ran the gamut.
Yep.
I nearly always felt like I should have been doing more. Like, if I'm resting, which is what I knew my body needed,
Sure.
I also felt like, but my kids need me and I need to be up and doing something for my kids. I remember getting out of the hospital, coming home for the first time, and my mom was living at my house helping take care of the kids so that my husband could go to work and still try to have some sort of normalcy in life, have the job, have the insurance that we needed. And I remember First morning I woke up that my mom was there, I remember waking up at 7:30 in the morning and thinking, okay, gotta get up, gotta get breakfast, gotta get the day going.
Yep.
And my mom said, Joe, what are you doing out of bed? I'm like, well, I gotta
I'm supposed to be doing all these things, yeah.
I gotta start doing all the things. And she says, you need to be resting and recovering and taking care of you. Well, that was steps that I hadn't thought about in a long time.
Yeah.
I hadn't had the, well, really, when you have kids, you put yourself aside a little bit and you do what needs to be done to take care of the kids. But it was also something I'd love to do. And so in my mind, I got home and I'm like, okay, I got to jump right back into this. And I didn't realize that my body was just not ready
you can't
for
do
that.
it.
I could not do it. And it was in the course of the first couple of weeks being home that I realized how sick of a person I really was. Because you don't always get the sense for that in the hospital.
Yeah.
In the hospital, they treat you like what you're experiencing is normal.
Sure.
Which at the time was a blessing because I didn't feel ostracized. I didn't feel like people were looking at me funny.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like they were treating me differently.
Well, because your environment is, everyone's kind of in the same situation.
People are in the same situation. They're used to dealing with this day in and day out. And it's their job. And they're not going to come in and look at you and say, oh my gosh, your face is paralyzed or something doesn't look right. They're there to help and to make sure that you don't go to certain places. And it was a wake-up call when I got home and realized that the rest of the world didn't see me like the ICU, the neuro ICU staff saw me. That to them, I was changed. And not only was I changed, but most of the world saw me as quite a bit weaker. And that was a hard realization to come to. And I think it hit me hardest the first time my mom took me out in public and we had to go to the Walgreens. We had to go to the pharmacy to pick up some of my prescriptions. And walking into the pharmacy, even though it was only a few steps, I couldn't walk on my own. And so I had to hold on to my mom's arm and grab onto the cart. And the cart was essentially my crutch. That was what was used to steady me. And I remember walking in, and of course my head is still shaved on the one side. I still can't blink. I don't remember if I was wearing an eye patch or not, but I saw what I would say was a good-looking 20, 30-something-year-old guy. And he just looked up as he passed, and then he put his head down, and then immediately he did this double take. And then his eyes followed me a little bit as I walked in. And it was the first real clue that I had that I was different.
Things have changed.
Things have changed, and the way that people see me, my physical body as well as the way that they perceive me has changed. To them, I was not the get her done, conquer the world girl I had been. I was, oh, there's something wrong with that lady. And that took a while to get used to. It was hard on me emotionally to see how differently people treated me because I knew that I was the same person on the inside, and it was a little bit difficult that other people could no longer see that, especially those that didn't know me. I'd always been given the benefit of the doubt before, and now suddenly people looked at me in a different way. And it made me stop and think very carefully about how I perceive others and what I see when I look at them, and realizing that there is very likely a story behind whatever I see. And I don't know that story.
Got it.
Just like they didn't know my story.
Exactly.
So those feelings of guilt and dealing with my mental health, it was a one day at a time.
Well, and I think, you know what? I think for the next video, I want to ask you some questions about how this impacted your marriage, because this is something I really am interested in because it's such a personal thing, right? And so so in our next video, we're actually going to go ahead and I'm going to ask Jodi how all of this, her experiences, have impacted her marriage. And so make sure to check out that next video.